Hi, I'm Kristine Quinn from Cal State Fullerton, and I'm here today to talk to you about learning journals. So, we're going to share the screen. Make sure I can find my screen. And here we go. This is the introduction to art journaling, and this is a way to use a new tool to increase the depth and complexity of learning in your classroom. When we're talking about depth and complexity, we're talking about how students can delve into content in a way that is deeper than surface learning. We're going to use art journaling as a creative tool to increase engagement and deepen that learning while they are using the creative processes. And the tool that we're learning is called learning journals. You're going to see through this webinar that each of the slides has examples of student work. Just to give you some background, the examples that I am using are from our teacher credential candidates that are in the elementary and bilingual education credential program. So these learning journals are also designed to use in K through 12 classrooms as well. So when we're defining the idea of a working journal, we're talking about a permanent collection, usually kept in a spiral binder of work that allows the learners to plan, capture, and reflect on their life's experiences. And we're using different mediums of art. We're using words, we're using images, we're using collage through the art processes in order for students to make connections, to practice their learning and metacognition, to use their inquiry skills, and to reflect on their learning. All of those deepen the learning process. So when we're talking about these ideas of learning journals, we're talking about four big ideas, four processes that students engage in while they are using the learning journals. The first is practice. When we are learning our creative processes and practicing our creative processes, we get better at them, just like reading, just like practicing any other skill, like soccer. Art is the same way. When we practice, we learn skills and we get better. It is the practice of inquiry, asking questions. I wonder what. I wonder what would happen if I put this on the page. I wonder what will happen if how this watercolor will react with another color. I wonder what will happen if I add thick lines or thin lines. The idea of practicing inquiry, asking questions. I wonder. The third is connecting. How do I connect to the content? Whether that content is visual and performing arts, whether that content is science or social studies or literacy. How do I connect my own personal thoughts, my own personal experiences to the content? And how do I represent that on a page? And then the fourth is reflecting. When I look at the content that I am learning, and I reflect. What have I learned? What does it mean to me? Why is it important? The objectives for using learning journals as a learning tool, you're going to hear me say art journals and learning journals, well, one and the same. They represent the same idea. Here's our objectives. We want students to connect with research on arts integration. Research tells us that the creative processes increases and deepens learning. We want our students to tap into their own creative practices. We want them to experiment with multimedia materials. That's the inquiry part, the experimentation. I wonder if. We want them to learn strategies for getting pages started in their learning journal. We want them to find one or two specific ways to integrate the learning journals into their courses and for you into your classrooms. And then we want them to learn how to start or continue a personal learning journal. And this part is the reflection part. When we're working with journals, we need materials. We need art materials. It is a multimedia art form, and you need hands-on physical materials. My first choice would be a nice bound multimedia paper journal. There are many brands out there, but you want to get at least about a 60-pound weight multimedia paper if you can. Second choice, if you don't have the money or the resources to buy your students good art journals, you can make your own, and there's many ways that you can do this. The most cost-effective way would probably be to get the construction paper that may be available at your own school sites. Fold those in half and uh, put a rubber band around the center, and then you have a very quick learning journal. You can also use file folders, old file folders in the very same way. Any way that you can bind papers together. You can staple those bindings, use sew the bindings, or just use rubber bands. So that would be my second choice, to have the students make them. And then you need materials for working inside of those journals. If I think about the very basics of learning journals, here are the things that I would want. I would definitely want acrylic paint. If you are working with younger students, you might want tempera paint. The difference is that acrylic paint is not water soluble and tempera paint is. I would want watercolors. I would want a variety of brushes. I would want some sort of glue, whether that's white Elmer's glue or glue sticks or Mod Podge or acrylic medium, any sort of adhesive. You're going to need scissors. You're going to need markers, construction paper. Now, if you have the means or if you have somebody who can donate to you, you might think about a few materials that are a little magic in the classroom. One is called bleeding tissue. This tissue, also called art tissue, is an ink-based tissue. It is not a gift wrapping tissue. It is a tissue that when you get it wet, it will leave ink behind. And you will see in some of the examples in the next few slides, I will point out where bleeding tissue is. Decorative papers are also very nice to have on hand, but they can be pricey. You can make decorative papers with construction paper and have your students paint them themselves. And then if you are lucky to have some funds, you might want some Sharpies and you might even want some gel pens. So the very basics, you want some sort of paint, some sort of markers, some sort of paper, some sort of glue. So learning journals provide opportunities and the challenge to take that new information, synthesize it, process it, reflect upon it, make personal connections to it, and then respond to that content in a visual format. So here you can see some student examples. When students read an article or listen to a story or read something in a textbook or look at primary source documents, whatever that content is, they really have to think deeply about it and process it, make connections to it, and say, how do I visually represent this on a piece of paper? So those real world connections and those personal experience become very strong. Learning journals utilize the visual and performing arts standards. Everything about these activities are standards based, K through 12 education, and in the credential program, the TPEs also require the teaching of visual and performing arts. So they are defined by a state framework, and there's also national standards that match the state standards as well. So when people say, why are you doing art? The answer is because it is standards based and it is required of me as a California state teacher. Visual literacy is also an important addition to the literacy standards in the Common Core standards. So you're going to see in the Common Core standards that students should be able to use images to use their visual literacy skills as well. So all of these ideas are standards-based. So just give you a little bit of background about how we use them here at California State University in the multiple subject credential program. Here's an example in the background of a student utilizing their art journal to uh, uh, state their learning philosophy. So it began as a tool for depth of learning. It was introduced in 2012 and by my colleague, Dr. Andrea Guillaume, and myself. And we were working with a school, Fullerton School District, who was also implementing learning journals with their students. So the goal is not only do we have our teacher candidates using it for their own learning, but that they take it to their K-12 classrooms to use with their students. That is the purpose. There's a growing research base of support for journaling as learning. All you have to do is Google the topic of art journaling as a learning process, and you're going to see that there are many, many, many resources that support the idea that that is a positive correlation between art journaling and the learning process. So for our candidates, we believe it's so important that each candidate receives a journal and an art kit at the beginning of their program so that it is always with them and they are able at any point in time to use that processing tool. We use it across the credential program, so they use it in every class, whether that's their literacy classes, their math classes, science, social studies, and all of the other courses that they take. So, how do teacher candidates use it? Again, here you're going to see some examples on the left-hand side. You can see that there are images. You can see that there are words. There is use of watercolor. There's use of pens. There's use of papers. There's use of cutting. There's use of collage. So, learners use this as a processing tool. The content provides the starting point in unique and different ways, and the journal is a place to reflect, analyze, deepen understanding, and to make those real life connections. The learning journals are not a place to keep traditional notes or handouts because that is not the purpose of this learning tool. Usually, notes or handouts are more about a lower level of learning than a higher level thinking skill. So, here's two more examples of student work. On the left-hand side, you will see that that journal entry is based in the bleeding tissue that I was telling you about before. That is the look that you get from the bleeding tissue. That two-page spread, that's what we call when you're looking at your journal with the binding open, it's called a two-page spread, represents the visual and performing arts standards. At that, as I'm looking around that page, I can see that that is for a different grade levels. I see 4.1 for music. I see 5.1 for visual arts. And you can see that they used different colors, different fonts, different mark making. And then on the right-hand side is a response to a current event. So words and images and their own ideas about what this content looks like in their heads and how they get it onto paper. So learning journals, again, are a place for processing content and using multiple means of representation and expression. You will see that that is part of the Universal Design for Learning framework, those words. They require the learner to do something new with that information, not just spit it back, not just repeat it. It requires critical and creative thinking and analysis. It provides opportunities for inquiry, problem solving, responding to and framing meaningful questions and reflection. And like I said before, it uses universal design and allows for all ability levels and languages. All of these processes lead to depth of learning and self-reflection. On this right-hand side, again, you can see bleeding tissue in the background, and you can see that this is a self-narrative, um, and this is in one of our classes where they were looking at their own ideas about their own culture. More learning outcomes. This activity increases metacognition and the understanding of how we know what we know, right? And that we do this in individual and unique ways, and we need opportunities for individual and unique responses and individual and unique reflections. They use visual literacy as a way of understanding. This idea stretches students, and in this point I say teacher candidates because those are my students, but any students, K through 12 and even into adulthood. This practice stretches the use of multiple approaches. It requires the student to see things in new and different ways and to access multiple ways of knowing. Every time you open your learning journal and work with multimedia materials, it requires problem solving. It requires spatial reasoning, making connections to new representations, using your content knowledge, not only your art content knowledge, but the content of the subject of the paper that you are creating. So you can see another current event response here in the background. And you can see that this student has chosen to use some quotes and things that are typed. That is absolutely one source of multimedia as well that they can use in their journals. So it requires candidates to understand not only the content, but to understand themselves, to understand how they learn and specifically how they understand. It requires them to take risks. They're not usually used to responding to content in an artistic way. They have to use their own authentic, unique inquiry while they are deciding what goes onto a page. And they have to think about how to organize their thought processes as well. So you can see already that these are all extremely high level of thought processes. This is an authentic avenue to social emotional learning. When students are working through their learning journals, quite often they are connecting to their own needs, to their own ideas, to their emotions. This is a way for students to connect their personal emotions to the content and how they personally feel about it. Because of those ideas, this is truly an authentic form of assessment where we really get to delve into what students know. Not did they learn the content I wanted them to learn, but what did they really, truly learn and know and be able to do as a result of this process. So communication of the learner's process and representation is a critical component of the learning. And one way that I do that is that students always share with each other and myself what the page represents and the processes that they went through to create this learning space. All right, so let's talk about what art journaling is not. Let's give those non-examples. This idea is not about artistic ability or skill. It is not about creating an end product that is pretty. It is not about judgment or comparison. It's not a place to take traditional notes. That doesn't require any sort of critical thinking or creative analysis, or a place to keep handouts. So if we go back to the idea that it's not about ability or skill, one of the four processes that we talked about in the very beginning was the idea of practice. As they are working through their journals, they will learn skill. They will practice techniques. They will increase their artistic ability, but it all takes practice. So here's two examples here. The question to contemplate: what happens when we ask learners to synthesize, reflect, and connect in a visual way? The answer is that they usually go far beyond what I could ever imagine. So you can see two different examples here of the responses to uh, different stimuli. And you can see that by looking at it visually, we could put our artistic eye to it, and we could talk about color schemes, or we could talk about the structure. We could talk about the elements of art or the principles of design. We could talk about the how one uses a lot of primary colors and secondary colors. We can see how the other uses neutrals. We can talk about the movement around the page, the texture that that is representing. But all of those ideas are secondary to the reflection of the artist themselves, the learner themselves. When we hear their own thoughts about what these pages represent, that is where we truly come to understand what the learning process is and where the depth of learning reveals itself. So again, that importance of analysis, and I wanted to share a student's response and a student's uh, journal page so that you can see just how deep my students can go with this process. So they work in their journals. They respond to some sort of stimuli, whether that is reading a, um, a research study or an article or a poem, or they watch a film, whatever the learning stimulus is. They work in their journal and then they photograph it. They turn it into me electronically, and then they use some sort of reflection, whether that is a written reflection. We are able to use voice recordings. In your Google Classrooms, you could probably have a lot of different tools in order for them to do that. And then we also can do those conversations face to face as well. Here's what this one student created. You can see also that we're translanguaging here. She's using her native language. And I just wanted to read to you her analysis. My journal spread was inspired over my ancestral home country, Honduras. I've been trying to find and learn about my ancestral history. I came across Berta Correces, who was a social justice activist in Honduras and was murdered for her activist movements in trying to protect the land and the people of the country. The journal spread includes a quote from Berta Correces during the 2015 Goldman Prize ceremony. Our Mother Earth, militarized, fenced in, poisoned, a place where basic rights are systematically violated, demands that we take action. Let us build societies that are able to coexist in a dignified way, in a way that protects life. Let us come together and remain hopeful as we defend and care for the blood of this earth and of our spirits. So she's taken a quote from that activist that she has been learning about, and now she explains what her artistic representation means. The red teardrops represent the innocent blood consistently spilled in the villages and cities. Cutouts of guns and bullets are in the windows and doorways, combining with the natural land in Honduras that is in consistent danger of disappearing and being poisoned. So it's really, to me, a very, very powerful page and a powerful example of students making personal connections to content. I said that this process is standards based, and for me, as a trainer of teachers, it is also standards based. And our standards are the teaching performance expectations. This aligns with the visual performing arts in the TPEs in multiple ways. So here's an example of where this activity supports what is required by the state. TPE1 is engaging and supporting all students in learning. And you can see through that standard, the state wants new teachers to be able to connect subject matter to real life contexts and provide active learning experiences to engage student interest, support student motivation, and allow students to extend their learning. You've seen that learning journals are certainly in support of that standard. Another one says that promotes students' critical and creative thinking and analysis through activities that provide opportunities for inquiry, problem solving, responding to and framing meaningful questions and reflection. That response that relates to everything that we've been talking about with the process of learning journals. And then to provide students with opportunities to access the curriculum by incorporating the visual and performing arts as appropriate to the content and context of learning. So this is where it fits into my standards in the credential program. In your K through 12 standards, it also fits into the visual and performing arts standards. There are 4 visual and performing art processes in every single grade level and 11 benchmark standards in the visual and performing arts and also in the media arts as well. So if we were to get started with learning journals, I would want you to think about these 4 processes to begin. When you begin a learning journal, after you have either purchased or made your learning journals, you want to teach your students about backgrounds, putting down those backgrounds, getting rid of that white paper. If we look back in the history of visual artists, quite often the very first thing that they do is to paint whatever canvas that they are using to get rid of that white so that it's not so intimidating. We can do this through acrylic paints, through tempera paints, through watercolors. We could use pastels, we could use markers, we could use crayons. Um, there's the multitude of choices of how you could create backgrounds. One of the other things that I told you about was that idea of bleeding tissue. So process that we use often in the learning journals is the idea of layering. And if you think about collage, layering one thing on top of the other. This is an art process that's utilized quite often in learning journals. The next one is about mark making or making your mark. We can think about this as lettering, and we do not, when we're thinking about lettering, it doesn't have to be something that we find on a computerized font. We all have our own personal fonts that we utilize in our own unique ways. And I want students getting used to using their own writing as mark making. We also know that this is a great place to practice our cursive writing, as cursive writing has made its way back into the curriculum. So it's personal. It's not about copying. It's about making unique marks that are individual to each person. Another type of mark making that we can use is zentangling or doodling. And that is the idea of that repetitive creation of repeated patterns and symbols. And then lastly, we want to think about spatial reasoning. This is practiced and utilized and expanded upon when we are using our learning journals. So students have to really think about the idea of using that whole space, providing for movement, creating a balance, making sure that all the words stay on the paper and fit in a certain way. Spatial reasoning is certainly something that we use in other places in life as well. If I can use these 4 processes, then my students will be very successful visually in creating learning journal spreads that are reflective, unique, informative, and connect to their own personal lives, as well as increase their own skills and strategies in the visual and performing arts. On this page, on the right-hand side, you can see that the pink and the orange are created using the bleeding tissue. The small patterns you can see on the right-hand side on the bottom half, those spiral patterns that go through the word theater. Those are Zen tangles. On the left-hand side, you can see above the music, those different shapes of triangles. Those are also Zen tangles. You can see different types of font that that person has used. You can see evidence that they have thought visually and spatially in creating a page that is balanced, takes up the whole place, provides the eye movement. Okay, so those four processes you can see on that page there. So I'm going to give you just a few student examples from different courses that are in our program, because again, those are my students, but I don't want you to think so much about the content as the idea that this process connects to every content. Okay, so when they first begin in their learning journals, this is one of the first pages they do, and I give them very specific requirements and those things that we just talked about. They have to use bleeding tissue for the background. They have to present the content of the visual and performing arts framework and standards in their grade level. They have to use clip art. That just means something that they have printed on paper. They have to use different types of lettering, and they have to use Zentangling. When I give them those 5 strategies or requirements to use, they are usually quite successful. It gives them some sort of structure as they are learning to create in their journals. If you start students off and you say simply, create a page, that's going to be very overwhelming and they won't necessarily know where to start. So I start by teaching strategies and structure and begin to take that scaffolding away as they gain more practice. They get used to using their inquiry skills. They get used to reflecting and responding. Here's that very same assignment with 2 different students' approaches. You can see again the bleeding tissue in the background. You can get very different effects from that. You can see that they both have clip art where they have printed something and pasted it onto their journal. You can see that they have Zentangling. Both pages have Zentangling. Both pages represent the content of the visual and performing arts. And they have different lettering. You can see the visual representation of universal design for learning, where this process allows for every learner's unique and individual response, and it allows individual and unique access to the curriculum. Learning journals aren't always about creating pretty pages. Sometimes they are about creating the exact opposite. This assignment was in a math methods class, and we called this disrupting inequities. And the idea was that they were looking at the data from their local school districts and their schools that they were placed in. They were looking at the testing data in mathematics and processing and analyzing that. And then the assignment was to think about how we were going to disrupt those inequities, because quite often our test scores, especially in math, are due to inequities in our curriculum. So as student teachers, they were to look at that and say, what is my role and how can I provide a different approach? How can I meet needs of students in different ways? How can I disrupt the inequities? And you can see some pages there. Again, it's not about creating pretty. Here's an example of some students working. You can see smiles on faces and joy that that brings. And the other thing that I wanted to point out on that right-hand side is my colleague, Dr. Kristine Mayfield, who's creating her own learning journal along with her students. That is a very powerful part of this process. When you can create with your students and they see you taking visual risks, it increases their own confidence level as well. Okay, so once they have learned some of those guidelines and they become comfortable in working in their journals, I set them free and take away the guidelines, and they begin to use what they know in new and unique ways to respond to different assignments. In this assignment, this is a response to an article about how art and social justice uh, coexist and what they mean to each other. You see, this student used what they know from those four processes: the background, the layering, the mark making, the processing, to come up with a creative and unique response. Here's two different ways that students in our foundations class created and responded to the prompt to create a teaching philosophy. You can see on the left-hand side that they used watercolors here. They used the lettering is called slow journaling, where you make wavy lines wide and small, and those letters have to go from top of the line to the bottom of the line. It's called slow journaling. The student on the right decided to use some printed clip art from the computer and created a very different response to the same assignment. Here's examples from our class in community building, and this lesson was about bullying prevention, I'm sorry. So you can see three different examples of how differently students responded to the same information, where they read literature, they looked at resources, they looked at research numbers, um, collected data, and then responded to it in unique and individual ways, connecting to their own metacognition and what they know about the content. Here's another class where they learn about the health framework and the health standards in the K-12 classroom. And again, this is a response to learning about what is at their grade level standards. You can see lettering, you can see collaging, you can see watercolor, you can see images, words, people utilizing the whole space, processing, reflecting, and representing. In our 437, which is our social studies methods class, we look at current events, and students each week choose their own current event to read and respond to in their journals. This is where we see a lot of passion come out. So, as we think about this and implementing it into our classrooms, it might seem overwhelming. You might say, I'm not an art teacher. I don't know if I can do this. But I want to ensure you that you do not need to be able to teach art in order to use this tool in your classroom. Students have all they need. If you choose to do journaling in your classroom, don't forget that art takes time and materials, and that there's also cleanup. So part of doing this in the classroom is to teach your students to respect materials and spaces and properly clean up. Don't forget to cover your tables whenever you're using paints and glue and oil pastels, all of those other things that can make our classroom very messy. So not all journal work needs to be done in class, especially if you have older students. Some of that work can be done at home as well. But the essential component that I want you to think about is the sharing aspect where students are able to talk to each other, to explain their vision, to hear other students' um, own pages and their vision of their creations as well, and to be able to have positive student discourse. Right? So they communicate how they processed, they communicate what their products show about their learning and their understanding. And it's wonderful when you can do it in person and have those small group conversations. If you don't have time for that, you can do that as recordings as well. So, in conclusion, I want you to think about where you can see journaling in your own teaching. Is there space for it? Can you see yourself introducing this new idea? How often can you see your students having this opportunity to create a learning journal page instead of a traditional assignment? What benefits can you see for your students? I want you to think about that right now. Do you think this would benefit students? I'm here to tell you that since 2012, I have firsthand evidence that this benefits students' learning and connects them to the content. And that when they create this visual representation, the content sticks to their bones. Can you think of any assignments that can be replaced by a journaling assignment in your classroom? Do you have them do any sort of character analysis? Do they do any sort of current events? Do they annotate um, literature? Do they look at primary source documents? Every assignment that you have in your classroom could be uh, also represented in a learning journal or replaced with a learning journal. So I want you to think too about your own ideas and creating a learning journal as well. How might you benefit personally from integrating more creativity into your own life, not just into your own classroom? The first step is the hardest. You just have to be brave. You just have to start. You just have to make the commitment. And I guarantee that your students will love you for it. Thank you for joining me today. And I hope to see you in the future and using learning journals in your classroom.